golden glow of chandeliers illuminated the polished wood floors of Callaway's, one of the most prestigious restaurants in Charleston, South Carolina. Inside, the air was thick with the clinking of wine glasses and hushed conversations, an atmosphere of quiet luxury cultivated over decades. Henry Callaway stood near the entrance, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room with the careful gaze of a man who had built something from the ground up. This restaurant was his legacy, a place for high society, elegance, and class. And then he saw them. The couple at the door, the man, Daniel Carter, wore a simple button-up shirt and well-worn jeans. The woman, Emily Carter, looked effortlessly elegant in a summer dress. But neither of them were draped in designer brands or the type of wealth that Callaway expected from his usual clientele. His lips pressed into a thin line. They didn't belong. Lisa Rodriguez, one of his best servers, stepped forward with a welcoming smile. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" Daniel nodded, handing over his name. Lisa checked the list. "Yes, Mr. Carter. Right this way." She barely took a step before Henry raised a hand. "Not tonight." Lisa blinked. "Sir?" Henry stepped forward, his voice polite but firm. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked." Daniel exchanged a glance with Emily, frowning slightly. "I made a reservation days ago," he said. Henry's smile was thin, forced. "Yes, well, we reserve the right to refuse service." A heavy silence fell over the entrance. Lisa's stomach twisted. Daniel exhaled slowly, his posture relaxed but controlled. "We're not causing any trouble," he said. "We just wanted a quiet dinner." Emily crossed her arms. "Is there a problem, Mr. Callaway?" Henry's gaze swept over them. A man who didn't dress like money. A woman who didn't flaunt wealth. They weren't his kind of customers. So he simply smiled and repeated, "Not tonight." Lisa saw the shift in Emily's expression. A flicker of hurt, disbelief. Daniel, however, only nodded. "Understood." Without another word, he took Emily's hand and turned to leave. Lisa felt a pang of discomfort in her chest. Something about this felt wrong. And the way Daniel walked away, not angry, not defensive, just calm, made her feel like this wasn't the last time they'd see him. Lisa watched the couple disappear through the grand entrance of Callaway's, her gut twisting with discomfort. Daniel had said nothing more, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a scene. And yet, the way he walked away, composed and unreadable, left an uneasy silence in the air. Emily, on the other hand, had made her feelings clear. The hurt in her eyes was unmistakable. Lisa glanced at Henry Callaway, expecting to see some flicker of doubt. There was none. He simply straightened his crisp suit jacket, then turned and strode back toward the dining area, as if nothing had happened. Lisa hesitated before following. She had worked at Callaway's for 3 years. She had seen Henry turn down guests before, but something about this time felt different. Maybe it was the way Daniel had accepted it without a fight, or maybe it was the way Emily had looked back one last time before leaving, like she was memorizing every detail, like she was planning something. Lisa shook the thought away and got back to work. The rest of the night passed smoothly, uneventfully, but even as she served the regular guests, the old money families, the local politicians, the socialites dripping in diamonds, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And she was right, because the next evening, Daniel and Emily Carter would return. And this time, they wouldn't be alone. The next evening, Callaway's buzzed with the usual energy of Charleston's elite. Men in tailored suits clinked glasses of aged whiskey. Women in elegant gowns laughed softly over candlelit tables. Henry Callaway stood near the bar, surveying his kingdom with quiet satisfaction. The previous night's incident? Forgotten, or so he thought. Because then, the doors swung open, and Daniel and Emily Carter walked in. But this time, they weren't alone. Lisa, carrying a tray of cocktails, nearly dropped a glass. Behind Daniel and Emily, at least a dozen people followed, a mix of men and women, powerful-looking, poised, important, and dressed not in designer labels, but in the kind of effortless wealth that didn't need to scream for attention. Lisa recognized some of them. Real estate moguls, business owners, investors, people who didn't need Callaway's, but Callaway's needed them. Henry's smile stiffened. Lisa watched as Daniel led the group straight to the hostess stand. His voice was calm, polite. "Good evening," he said. "We have a reservation." Lisa felt the shift in the room. A few guests were watching now, murmuring in low tones. Charles Benson, the restaurant's manager, appeared beside Henry, scanning the list. "Yes," Charles said quickly, trying to regain control. "Right this way." But Henry, he didn't move, didn't blink. He was still processing what was happening, because he recognized someone in that group. Elliot Chambers, a name that meant money, influence, and more importantly, someone whose word carried weight in Charleston's business world. Henry's throat went dry. Lisa held her breath. Daniel smiled, that same calm expression as the night before. And as he walked past Henry, he said, just loud enough to be heard, "Not tonight?" Then without another glance, he followed the hostess to the best table in the house, and Henry Calloway, for the first time in a long, long time, had no idea what to do. Henry Calloway felt the shift before he even processed what had just happened. His restaurant, his domain, was now hosting the very people he had turned away just one night ago. And worse, they had brought the kind of guests that made or broke reputations in Charleston. Lisa could see the conflict playing out across Henry's face. She had never seen him look this unsure before. Charles Benson, ever the professional, cleared his throat. "Should I check on them, sir?" Henry hesitated. For the first time, he wasn't sure how to respond. Then, he straightened his posture, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket. "No," he said. "Treat them like any other customer." Lisa nearly laughed out loud at the irony, because last night, they hadn't been treated like customers at all. At the best table in the house, Daniel and Emily sat with their guests, the soft hum of conversation filling the space. But there was an unspoken tension beneath it all. Lisa approached, trying to ignore the way Henry kept glancing toward them. She took a deep breath. "Good evening," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Can I get anyone started with drinks?" Daniel looked up at her, and for a moment she expected coldness, expected him to be angry. But instead he just smiled. "Nice to see you again, Lisa." Her stomach twisted. He remembered her name. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "Likewise, Mr. Carter." She took the drink orders, but as she turned to leave, Emily spoke, just loud enough for Henry to hear. "This is a lovely restaurant," she said. "It's a shame not everyone gets to experience it." Lisa heard the subtle weight in her words, and so did Henry. From across the room, she saw his jaw tighten. He knew. This wasn't just about a dinner reservation anymore. This was about a message. Henry's realization. Charles leaned in toward Henry. "This isn't good," he murmured. Henry let out a slow breath. He had spent years building Calloway's reputation. And now, one mistake, one moment of judgment, could destroy it. Lisa watched as Henry's gaze flicked toward Daniel. For the first time since he opened this restaurant, Henry Calloway wondered if he had been wrong. The restaurant hummed with the usual air of refinement, but for Henry Calloway, the night had turned into something far from ordinary. He had spent decades building Calloway's reputation, an establishment that catered to the elite, the refined, the wealthy, and yet last night he had turned away a man who clearly belonged among them, a man who had returned tonight with some of the most powerful people in Charleston. Henry felt a prickle of unease settle in his chest. "Who exactly is Daniel Carter?" he muttered. Charles Benson, his ever-efficient manager, had already done the research. He handed Henry a phone screen, a Google search already pulled up. Henry's breath caught. Daniel Carter, CEO of Carter Holdings, a private investment firm managing millions in assets. Named one of South Carolina's top 10 philanthropists for his work in funding small businesses. Major investor in Charleston's local economy, restaurants, hotels, and historical preservation projects. Henry's stomach sank. The man he had judged based on appearance alone, the man he had dismissed without a second thought, was someone who could make or break businesses. "Sir?" Charles asked carefully. Henry set the phone down, inhaling sharply, for the first time in years. He wasn't sure what to do. Meanwhile, At the Carter table, Lisa set a tray of drinks in front of Daniel's group, her hands steadier than she expected. Daniel met her eyes, giving her a polite nod. "Thank you, Lisa." Again, the small but deliberate use of her name. Lisa hesitated. She had been trained to see people in the restaurant as guests, not individuals. But Daniel saw people. Emily, sensing Lisa's hesitation, gave her a small smile. "Do you like working here?" she asked softly. Lisa's throat went dry. That question, so simple, yet so heavy. Her mind flashed back to Henry's dismissal of the Carters the night before. The tension in the restaurant tonight. The way Henry now looked uncertain for the first time ever. Lisa hesitated. Then, she chose honesty. "It used to feel like the best job in the world," she admitted. Emily nodded. "And now?" Lisa glanced toward Henry, who was still staring at his phone. "Now?" she murmured. "I'm not so sure." Henry Calloway sat in his usual spot near the bar, but for the first time he wasn't relaxed. The weight of his mistake settled on his chest like a heavy stone. He had turned Daniel Carter away without a second thought. And now, Daniel was sitting in his restaurant at the best table, surrounded by Charleston's most influential people. People Henry had spent years trying to impress. He exhaled sharply, watching Lisa move between tables. Something about her expression, uncertainty, hesitation, made his discomfort grow. Had she been questioning him? Had other employees noticed? He had always believed that Calloway's was a place of exclusivity, a restaurant for people who fit a certain mold. But now he couldn't shake the thought. Had he been wrong all this time? At the Carter table, a different perspective. Lisa returned with their entrees, carefully placing them in front of each guest. Daniel smiled, nodding his thanks. Emily, however, was still watching Lisa. "You seem thoughtful," Emily said gently. Lisa hesitated. She wasn't sure if she should respond. Then, something inside her shifted. "I guess I just never thought about it before," Lisa admitted. Emily tilted her head. "Thought about what?" Lisa swallowed. "How different things look from the other side." Daniel, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "What do you mean?" Lisa glanced toward Henry, who was still staring at them from across the restaurant. "I guess I always thought he was right," she admitted, "that Calloway's was about tradition. About a certain standard." Daniel's expression remained neutral. "And now?" he asked. Lisa let out a small breath. "Now I'm starting to wonder if tradition is just another word for exclusion." Emily's smile was small, but knowing. "You're a smart woman, Lisa." Lisa blinked, caught off guard by the genuine warmth in Emily's tone. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded and walked away. Henry faces his reflection. Across the room, Henry watched the interaction between Lisa and the Carters, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Doubt, regret. He turned toward Charles, his longtime manager, who had been observing everything. "Charles," Henry muttered. Charles arched an eyebrow. "Yes, sir," Henry exhaled. "Do you think I made a mistake?" Charles didn't answer immediately. Then, he gave a small, knowing smile. "I think, sir, that you already know the answer to that." Henry's chest tightened, because deep down he did know, and for the first time in years he wasn't sure how to fix it. Henry Calloway paced inside his office, the muffled sounds of the restaurant buzzing outside his door. He had built Calloway's from nothing, turned it into one of the most respected dining establishments in Charleston. And yet, one mistake, one miscalculation, and now everything felt different. Charles Benson leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "You seem troubled, sir." Henry sighed, rubbing his temples. "I misjudged him." Charles remained silent. Henry let out a short, bitter laugh. "I didn't even ask his name last night. Just looked at him and decided he didn't belong here." Charles nodded slowly. "And now?" Henry glanced toward the door, where the Carter table was still enjoying their meal. "They belong here more than I do," he muttered. Meanwhile, at the Carter table, Lisa set down another round of drinks, her movements careful, her mind still racing. She had been watching Henry all night, and for the first time, She saw something in him that she had never seen before. Uncertainty, regret. Emily smiled at Lisa. "Everything all right?" Lisa hesitated. Then before she could second-guess herself, she said, "I think he's realizing his mistake." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Is that so?" Lisa nodded. "He's not saying it, but I can see it in his face." Emily exchanged a glance with Daniel. Then softly she said, "Maybe it's time someone told him it's okay to be wrong." Lisa felt something shift inside her. She had worked at Callaway's for years. She had respected Henry. But maybe the real test of character wasn't in never making mistakes. Maybe it was in admitting them. Henry's decision. Henry exhaled and turned to Charles. "I need to do something." Charles arched an eyebrow. "Sir?" Henry squared his shoulders. "I don't know if I can fix this," he admitted. "But I can try." Charles smiled. "Then I suggest you start now." Henry Callaway took a deep breath, straightened his jacket, and stepped out of his office. Every instinct told him to stay behind closed doors, to pretend this wasn't happening. But he had built Callaway's on his reputation, and if he didn't face this now, that reputation wouldn't survive. Lisa, still watching from across the room, froze as Henry made his way toward the Carter table. This was it, the moment she had never thought she'd see. Henry Callaway, a man who never admitted fault, was about to do just that. At the Carter table, Daniel Carter was mid-conversation when he saw Henry approaching. The table quieted slightly, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Emily placed her glass down, exchanging a glance with her husband. Henry stopped just before the table. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then in a voice steady but lacking its usual confidence, he said, "Mr. Carter." Mrs. Carter Daniels sat back in his chair, watching him with mild curiosity. Henry cleared his throat. "I owe you both an apology." Lisa nearly dropped the tray she was holding. Henry continued, his gaze moving from Daniel to Emily. "I misjudged you," he admitted, "and in doing so, I went against everything this restaurant is supposed to stand for." Emily remained quiet, letting him speak. Henry exhaled. "Callaway's was never meant to be about exclusion, and last night I forgot that." Lisa could feel the tension in the air. Guests at nearby tables had started to listen in. Henry Callaway, the man who never second-guessed his decisions, was standing in the middle of his own restaurant, admitting he had been wrong. Daniel studied him carefully. Then, he smiled. "Thank you," he said simply. Henry blinked as if expecting more resistance. Emily's voice was softer, but just as firm. "We didn't come back for revenge, Mr. Callaway," she said. "We came back to remind you of something." Henry hesitated. "And what's that?" Emily smiled. "That real class isn't about wealth." Henry's breath caught, because she was right. He had built his restaurant for the elite, but somewhere along the way, he had forgotten what real elegance was. Not designer suits, not expensive jewelry, but character. And tonight, Daniel and Emily had more of it than he ever had. Henry nodded slowly. "Enjoy your meal," he said, voice quiet. Then without another word, he turned and walked away. Lisa watched him go, something unspoken settling in her chest. The power in Callaway's had shifted tonight, and she had a feeling nothing would ever be the same again. The restaurant had never felt quieter to Henry Callaway. Even as waiters moved between tables, even as the murmur of conversation continued, he could feel the weight of what had just happened. He had stood before Daniel and Emily Carter, and he had apologized. For the first time in his career, he had admitted he was wrong. But now came the hardest part. What came next? Lisa's perspective, a new understanding. Lisa Rodriguez moved between tables, her mind still turning over the moment she had just witnessed. Henry Callaway had just done something she never thought possible. He had swallowed his pride. And yet, Lisa could see it in his face, the way he moved slower than usual, the way he avoided eye contact with guests. He wasn't just feeling the weight of an apology, he was feeling the consequences, because now people knew. The guests had heard, the staff had watched, and Callaway's would never be the same again. Lisa exhaled slowly as she approached the Carter table, forcing herself to smile as naturally as possible. "Can I get you anything else?" Emily glanced up at her, something warm and knowing in her eyes. "We're good, Lisa," she said gently. Lisa hesitated. Then before she could stop herself, she blurted out, "I've worked here for 3 years." Daniel raised an eyebrow, curious. Lisa continued, her voice softer, more thoughtful than usual. "And I think this is the first time I've ever seen him admit he was wrong." Emily gave a small, understanding nod. Lisa swallowed, gripping her notepad. "I don't know what this place is going to look like after tonight," she admitted, "but I know it's going to be different." Daniel's smile was subtle but approving. "Different doesn't have to be bad," he said simply. Lisa didn't reply, because deep down she wasn't sure which way this change would go. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't the only one wondering if Calloway's was still the place for her. Henry Calloway sat in his private office, the door closed, the restaurant's noise muffled. He had done what no one expected him to do. He had apologized, but now the question lingered in his mind. Had it been enough? He reached for a glass of bourbon, staring at the golden liquid swirling in the dim light. Admitting he was wrong had been difficult, but doing something about it? That felt impossible. Lisa's doubt grows out in the dining area. Lisa watched as Henry disappeared into his office. A part of her had hoped that his apology would lead to something more, that he'd come out and change the way Calloway's worked, that he'd make it a place where everyone felt welcome. But now she wasn't sure. Would he actually change, or would this just be another moment swept under the rug? Lisa's grip tightened around her tray. She had spent years here, but for the first time she wondered if she belonged somewhere else. At the Carter table, the final message. Daniel took a slow sip of wine, his expression calm, unreadable. Across from him, Emily was watching Henry's closed office door. "He's struggling," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "He's spent his whole life believing one thing, and now he's being forced to reconsider it." Emily turned back to her husband. "What if he doesn't change?" Daniel smiled, but there was something knowing behind it. "Then that's his loss." Emily exhaled, glancing at Lisa, who was still deep in thought across the room. "Maybe he's not the only one who needs to reconsider things," Emily murmured. Daniel followed her gaze. Then he smiled. Because Emily was right. Henry Calloway wasn't the only one at a crossroads tonight. Henry's final decision. Henry stared at his reflection in the office window. The man looking back at him was uncertain. For the first time in his career, he didn't know what came next. But then, a thought settled into his mind. Maybe change wasn't about knowing what comes next. Maybe it was just about taking the first step. Henry set his bourbon down, and with a deep breath, he stood up. Because if Calloway's was going to survive, he had to change, for real this time. Henry Calloway emerged from his office, his face unreadable. The restaurant was still bustling, guests enjoying their meals as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. He spotted Lisa near the bar, deep in thought, her expression tense. And across the room, Daniel and Emily Carter, calmly finishing their meal. For a moment, Henry hesitated. Then with a deep breath, he strode toward the center of the dining room. Lisa's eyes snapped to him, sensing something was about to happen. Henry stopped near the Carter table, but this time, he didn't just speak to them. He spoke to the entire restaurant. A bold announcement. Henry cleared his throat, his voice steady but carrying weight. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his gaze sweeping over his carefully selected clientele. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge something important." The room quieted. Servers paused. Guests turned their heads. Lisa felt her pulse quicken. Henry had never made a public statement like this before. "I have always believed Calloway's was a place of tradition, a place for refinement, a place that catered to a certain clientele." His gaze briefly flickered to Daniel. "And last night, that belief led me to make a mistake." Murmurs rippled through the dining room. Lisa's breath caught. "Was he really doing this?" Henry continued, his voice unwavering. "I judged someone not by who they were, but by how they looked. And in doing so, I went against the very principles this restaurant should stand for." More whispers. Some in agreement, some in confusion. But Henry didn't stop. "Effective immediately, Calloway's will no longer be a restaurant that judges guests by appearances." Lisa's eyes widened. Was he really changing? Henry exhaled, his voice softer now. This place was built to celebrate people, not to exclude them. And it's time we start acting like it. Silence settled over the restaurant. Then, a few scattered claps. Lisa turned toward the source. Daniel Carter. He smiled, nodding slightly. And slowly, more applause followed. Not everyone joined in, but enough did. And in that moment, Lisa knew. Callaway's had changed forever. Lisa stood frozen, her heart pounding. Henry Callaway, the man who had built his reputation on exclusivity, had just publicly renounced his own way of doing business. It was the kind of moment that didn't happen at Callaway's. And yet, here it was. The applause faded, and the restaurant slowly returned to normal. But Lisa, she knew nothing would be the same again. At the Carter table, a closing conversation. Daniel took a final sip of his wine, then turned to Henry, who still stood a few feet away. That was quite the announcement, Daniel said, his voice calm, measured. Henry exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I suppose it was, he admitted. Emily smiled. You did the right thing. Henry chuckled, a little bitter, a little uncertain. I hope so, he murmured. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I think you'll find that real class isn't about keeping people out, he said. It's about who you choose to welcome in. Henry's chest tightened, because that was exactly what he had failed to do. But now he had a second chance, and those weren't given often. Lisa's crossroads. Lisa watched as Daniel and Emily rose from their table. They had finished their meal. They had made their point. And now they were leaving Callaway's behind. But what about her? She had spent years working under Henry's rigid standards. She had believed in them. Now, she wasn't sure if this place, even with its new direction, was where she belonged. Emily caught Lisa's gaze as she passed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily gave her a small, knowing smile. Lisa didn't know what it meant, but she knew she had a choice to make. Henry's final thought. As the Carters exited the restaurant, Henry finally sat down at the bar, his hands clasped together. Charles approached, eyeing him carefully. Well, Charles said. That was something. Henry let out a tired laugh. It was. Charles leaned against the bar, thoughtful. You think you can really change this place? Henry didn't answer immediately. Then, he nodded. I have to try, he said. Otherwise, what was all of this for? And for the first time in a long time, Henry Callaway felt like Callaway's had a future again. Lisa Rodriguez stood by the hostess stand, absently straightening the menus, her mind elsewhere. The Carters were gone. Their message had been delivered. And Henry Callaway, he had finally taken the first step toward change. But for Lisa, one question remained. Did she still belong here? The morning after. A new Callaway's? The next day, Lisa arrived earlier than usual, stepping into the restaurant as the morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floors. It looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. She found Henry in his office, reviewing paperwork. He glanced up when she knocked on the open door. You're in early, he noted. Lisa folded her arms. So are you. Henry smirked slightly. Some things need to change. And fast. Lisa hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging her since last night. What now? Henry exhaled, leaning back in his chair. Now, he said, we start over. Lisa arched an eyebrow. You think one apology changes everything? Henry's jaw tightened. No, he admitted, but it's a start. Lisa studied him. He looked different, not just tired, but thoughtful, determined. Maybe, just maybe, he really meant it. The staff meeting, a divided room. That afternoon, Henry called a staff meeting. Every server, every cook, every bartender, everyone who made Callaway's run gathered in the dining area. Henry stood at the front, Charles beside him, Lisa watching from the side. Starting today, Henry said, we're doing things differently. Murmurs rippled through the group. One of the senior servers, a man named Greg, crossed his arms. What does that mean exactly? Henry held his gaze. It means we treat every guest with the same respect, regardless of appearance. More murmurs. some nodding, others skeptical. Greg scoffed. So we just let in anyone now? Lisa bristled at his tone. But Henry, he didn't react. We let in people who want to enjoy a good meal, he said simply. Silence. Lisa glanced around, seeing the divided reactions. Some of them, mostly the younger staff, looked hopeful. Others, less so. And that's when Lisa realized Henry's biggest challenge wasn't just changing the restaurant. It was changing the people inside it. The room was tense. Henry Calloway stood firm, but the energy from his staff was split down the middle. Some nodded in approval. Others, like Greg, weren't convinced. Lisa could feel the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just a change in policy. It was a fundamental shift in the identity of Calloway's. And some people weren't ready for that. Lisa's choice, stay or go. Greg shook his head, arms crossed. I don't know, Henry, he said. This place has always been about class. You start changing the rules and you change the whole restaurant. Henry's expression hardened. Maybe that's the point. The words hung in the air. Greg scoffed. Well, that's not the Callaways I signed up for. Henry didn't flinch. Then maybe you're in the wrong place. Greg's jaw tightened. He looked around, as if waiting for someone to back him up. No one did. Lisa exhaled slowly. Then she did something she never thought she'd do. She stepped forward. I think Henry's right, she said, voice steady. Greg snapped his head toward her. You do? Lisa nodded. For years, I thought this place was about tradition, about keeping things the way they were. She glanced at Henry. But maybe tradition isn't about excluding people. Henry stiffened slightly, as if he hadn't expected Lisa to defend him. Lisa turned back to Greg. You don't have to like it, she said, but you can't ignore what happened last night. If we don't change, we'll fall behind. Greg gritted his teeth. Then, he shook his head. This isn't for me. Without another word, he walked out. A few other staff members shifted uncomfortably, but no one followed him. Lisa's heart pounded as she turned back to Henry. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then, Henry nodded, and Lisa knew, in that moment, she was staying. The beginning of something new after the meeting, Henry stood alone at the bar, rubbing his temple. Lisa approached, clearing her throat. You all right? Henry chuckled. Not sure. Lisa smirked. Well, that makes two of us. He looked at her, curious. You could have left, he said. Why didn't you? Lisa shrugged. Maybe I wanted to see if you were serious. Henry exhaled. I guess we're both taking a risk then. Lisa smiled. Yeah, I guess we are. And for the first time, Calloway's didn't feel like his restaurant anymore. It felt like theirs. The next few days at Calloway's felt like walking on new ground. The restaurant looked the same. The staff was mostly the same. But the energy? Completely different. Lisa could feel it in the way people whispered in the kitchen, in the way Henry carried himself, like he was waiting to see if his decision would hold or if it would crumble. Lisa's perspective, a slow shift. Lisa stood at the hostess stand, adjusting menus when a couple walked in. They were dressed simply, the kind of people Henry might have turned away before. For a brief second, Lisa hesitated. Would Henry still hesitate? She looked at him across the room. He was watching, waiting. Then, he gave a small nod. Lisa exhaled. Welcome to Calloway's, she said, smiling. Right this way. And just like that, the change became real. Meanwhile, Henry's internal struggle. Henry sat at the bar, stirring his drink absent-mindedly. Charles Benson approached, crossing his arms. Well, Charles said, you did it. Henry let out a slow breath. I did. Charles chuckled. You sure about this? Henry glanced around the restaurant, at the customers who, days ago, wouldn't have been welcome, at Lisa, who had chosen to stay, and for the first time he didn't feel unsure. He felt something else. Hope. Yeah, Henry said, nodding. I think I am. Lisa could feel the shift happening in real time. The restaurant's new policy had only been in place for a few days, but the effects were already rippling outward. Some customers, regulars who had been coming for years, barely seemed to notice. Others, they had noticed plenty, Lisa had overheard more than one complaint from guests whispering about how Callaway's was changing too much. But just as many people, new customers, fresh faces, walked in looking pleasantly surprised. A few even said, "We never thought we'd be welcome here." Lisa wasn't sure whether that warmed her heart or broke it. Maybe both. Henry faces the reality of change. Henry sat at his usual spot at the bar, but for the first time he wasn't drinking. He was just watching. Lisa walked over, sensing his internal struggle. "Something on your mind?" she asked. Henry let out a slow breath. "Just thinking about what Greg said before he left," he admitted. Lisa stiffened. Greg had made it very clear that he didn't believe in this new Callaway's, that it would fall apart if they changed too much. Lisa crossed her arms. "Well," she said, "Greg's not here anymore." Henry smirked slightly. "That's true." Lisa glanced around. The restaurant was still running. Guests were still enjoying their meals. Callaway's hadn't fallen apart. If anything, it was finally evolving. Henry sighed. "I guess I just didn't realize how much pushback there'd be." Lisa shrugged. "Change isn't easy." Henry gave her a sidelong glance. "And you? You still think you made the right choice staying?" Lisa thought about it for a second. Then, she smiled. "Yeah," she said, "I do." Henry nodded. For the first time, Callaway's felt like a place that belonged to both of them. A visitor from the past. Just as the evening settled into a comfortable rhythm, the front door swung open. Lisa turned automatically, ready to greet the new guests, then froze. Henry followed her gaze, and his expression darkened. Because standing at the entrance, looking completely at ease, was someone neither of them had expected to see. Greg, the former employee who had walked out in frustration, and he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a well-dressed man in a dark suit, surveying the restaurant like he was assessing it. Lisa's stomach tightened. Something about this felt off. Henry set his drink down, straightened his shoulders, and muttered under his breath, "Well, this should be interesting." Greg stood at the entrance, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. Beside him, the well-dressed man in the tailored suit took a slow step forward, scanning the restaurant with a calculated gaze. Henry Callaway knew the look well. This wasn't just a customer. This was someone who sized up investments. Someone who didn't visit restaurants. He bought them. Lisa's instincts immediately kicked in. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a casual visit. A dangerous offer. Henry finally spoke, his voice steady. "You want to buy Callaway's?" Vincent Adler gave a slow nod. "Yes, we see potential here. A brand ready to be expanded, modernized, and redefined. You've made some bold changes, Mr. Callaway. But change is difficult. We're offering you a way out, a chance to walk away on your own terms." Lisa felt her chest tighten. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. Greg, standing beside Adler, chuckled. "I told him you'd listen, Henry. You've got to admit, running this place isn't what it used to be. You've got staff questioning you, old customers leaving, and new ones wondering if this place even knows what it wants to be. Why fight the inevitable?" Henry's jaw clenched. Lisa could see the tension in his posture. The old Henry Callaway, the man who had once believed Callaway's was untouchable, might have considered this deal. But the man standing in front of her now, she wasn't so sure. Henry's decision. Henry folded his arms, studying Adler. "And if I say no," Adler smiled, "then you continue struggling. Change is messy, and restaurants don't survive messes for long. I think you know that." Lisa held her breath. She knew Henry wasn't just thinking about himself. He was thinking about his staff, about the restaurant's legacy, about what Callaway's meant. He could take the money and walk away, let someone else deal with the fallout, or he could fight for what was his. The silence stretched. Then finally Henry spoke. "You're right about one thing, Adler. Change is messy, and for a long time, I was afraid of it." Adler's smirk widened slightly, like he thought he was about to win. "But here's the thing," Henry continued. "I'd rather struggle through change than sell out to someone who doesn't understand what this place is." Lisa's heart pounded. Adler's smile faded. Greg exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Henry, don't be an idiot." Henry didn't even look at him. This restaurant isn't for sale. Adler studied him for a moment, then sighed. That's disappointing, he said. But expected. He turned toward Greg. Let's go. Greg hesitated, but after a moment, he followed. Lisa watched them leave, her chest still tight. She turned to Henry, half expecting to see regret on his face. But instead, he looked lighter. For the first time, he looked like a man who knew exactly what he wanted. And Calloway's? It was still his. Ban noi jung. Min se viet lai chung moi voi he fan jai ju. Gyong hu ka chung truok. Jam bao ju chiu sao va sufat trian hopli. Bai gio, min se bat jiao voi fan mot kua chuang moingai lap tuk. The door to Calloway's swung shut, and the presence of Vincent Adler and Greg was gone. But their visit, it left something behind. A ripple in the air, a question hanging over everything. Lisa glanced at Henry, waiting for a reaction, for anger, frustration, doubt. But instead, Henry just stood there, staring at the entrance like he was trying to process what had just happened. You okay? Lisa asked, her voice careful. Henry exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know, he admitted, but I know I made the right call. Lisa studied him. The old Henry Calloway would have never turned down an offer like that. The old Henry Calloway would have seen dollar signs, an easy exit, a way out. But this version of him, the one who had just rejected millions of dollars to hold on to Calloway's, this was someone different. Lisa nodded. Good, because if you'd sold, I would have walked out right after them. Henry smirked slightly. That's so? Yeah, Lisa said without hesitation, because it was the truth. Rumors and reactions. By the end of the night, word had already spread. The staff whispered in the kitchen. Some regulars, those who thought Calloway's had already changed too much, looked uneasy. One guest, an older man in a navy suit, pulled Henry aside before leaving. Not sure if I should call you a fool or a man of principle, he said. Henry just smiled. Maybe a little of both. The man chuckled, shaking his head before heading out. Lisa saw all of it. The mixed reactions, the uncertainty. Change wasn't just a decision, it was a battle. And Henry had just declared war on the old way of thinking. The night at Calloway's was winding down, but the tension remained. Lisa could feel it as she moved between tables, collecting empty glasses and wiping down surfaces. Some customers were still whispering, glancing toward Henry like he had made a grave mistake. Others nodded at him in quiet approval. And the staff? They were divided. Some servers looked uncertain, as if they weren't sure what Calloway's was anymore. Others, the younger ones, seemed hopeful. Lisa could tell this wasn't over. Henry had made his choice, but now he had to live with it. Henry's unfinished battle. Henry sat at the bar staring at the whiskey glass in front of him, but tonight he didn't drink. Charles approached, arms crossed. You're really doing this, he said. Henry exhaled. Yeah. You think you'll regret it? Henry chuckled, shaking his head. I think I'll regret it more if I don't try. Charles nodded, considering that. Well, he said, then I guess we better make sure it works. Lisa overheard the conversation and felt something settle in her chest. Henry wasn't just saying the words, he meant it. And that changed everything. A shift in loyalty. Lisa approached Henry as the last guest filed out. So, she said, leaning against the bar. What now? Henry let out a slow breath. Now we prove them wrong. Lisa smirked. You think we can? Henry finally met her eyes, his expression steady. We have to. Lisa thought about Greg, Adler, the old way of doing things. She thought about how close Calloway's had come to being sold off and turned into something unrecognizable. And she knew, deep down, she had made the right choice staying. For better or worse, Calloway's was worth fighting for. Lisa extended a hand. Then let's get to work. Henry looked at her hand for a second. Then he shook it. And just like that, Calloway's future was officially in their hands. The next morning, Calloway's felt different. Lisa arrived early, stepping into the quiet dining room, the scent of freshly brewed coffee already filling the air. It looked the same, but the weight of yesterday's decision still lingered. Henry had chosen to fight for this place. Now they had to prove it was worth saving. The pushback begins. By midday, the resistance started. Some of the longtime servers, those who had been with Calloway since the beginning, were clearly unhappy. Lisa overheard whispers from the kitchen. "This isn't the Calloways I signed up for. Henry's making a mistake. We're going to lose our best customers." Lisa's jaw tightened, but she kept moving. Change was never easy. She just hoped Henry was ready for what was coming. A difficult lunch shift. The lunch rush was busier than expected. New faces mixed with old ones. Some regulars left without ordering, shaking their heads in disappointment. Others stayed, curious about what Calloway's had become. Lisa moved through the tables, handling everything as smoothly as she could, but she could feel the tension. They weren't just running a restaurant today. They were defending it. An unexpected guest. Just as Lisa caught her breath, the front door swung open. She turned, expecting another customer. Instead, she saw someone she never thought she'd see again. A tall figure stood in the entrance, dressed in a tailored suit, older, confident, and unmistakable. Henry looked up from behind the bar and froze. Lisa's heart pounded, because standing there, surveying the restaurant with a critical eye, was Henry's younger brother, and from the look on his face, he wasn't here for a friendly visit. The restaurant fell silent as Henry Calloway's younger brother stepped inside. Lisa could feel the shift in energy. This wasn't just any visitor. This was someone who had history here. And from the way Henry stiffened behind the bar, that history wasn't good. A tense reunion. Henry slowly placed the glass he had been holding onto the counter. "Mark," he said, his voice measured. Mark Calloway smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's been a long time, Henry." Lisa looked between them, trying to piece together what was happening. Mark was taller than Henry, leaner, with the kind of presence that demanded attention. And he wasn't just here for a friendly visit. She could see it in his posture. This was business. Old wounds resurface. Henry finally stepped out from behind the bar, arms crossed. "You didn't come all this way just to check on me," Henry said. Mark chuckled. "No, I didn't." He glanced around the restaurant, taking in the changes. "Word gets around," he said. "Calloway's is different now." Henry's jaw tightened. "It needed to be." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Did it?" Lisa didn't like where this was going. Mark turned back to Henry, his voice dropping lower. "You're making a mistake, Henry. You always have." Lisa's stomach twisted. Whatever had happened between them, it ran deep. The offer no one saw coming. Mark exhaled, shaking his head. "I came here with a proposal," he said. Henry tensed. "I'm not interested." "You haven't even heard it yet." "I don't need to," Mark smirked. "That's always been your problem, Henry. You think you know everything." Lisa held her breath. Mark took a step closer. "I have investors willing to take Calloway's national, franchise it, turn it into something bigger than you ever imagined." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. Franchise. Calloway's wasn't just being challenged. It was being threatened. Henry's expression darkened. "This place isn't for sale, Mark." Mark studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "We'll see about that." Then without another word, he turned and walked out. Lisa exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. Henry stared at the door long after it had closed, and Lisa knew. This fight was far from over. Lisa had never seen Henry look this unsettled. For years, he had been the undisputed leader of Calloway's, a man whose word was final, whose presence carried weight. But now, after his brother's unexpected visit, after the franchise offer, after the weeks of pushing through resistance, for the first time, it felt like everything could slip away. The weight of a legacy. Henry sat in his office, the door slightly ajar. Lisa hesitated before stepping inside. "You okay?" she asked. Henry exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Been a hell of a few weeks." Lisa sat across from him, waiting. "You ever wonder," Henry said, voice lower now, "if maybe I should have just let it go?" Lisa frowned. "What do you mean?" Henry gestured vaguely. "This restaurant, the fight, everything." Lisa studied him carefully. "If you really thought that," she said slowly, "you would have sold it the moment Adler made his first offer." Henry chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe, Lisa leaned forward. You didn't take the offer because this place still means something to you. Henry didn't respond right away. Then finally he nodded. Yeah, he admitted. It does, Lisa smirked. Then stop acting like you lost already. Henry laughed, really laughed, for the first time in days. Guess I needed to hear that, he said. Lisa shrugged. That's what I'm here for. And just like that, Henry Calloway was back. A line in the sand. Later that night, Henry stood in front of the entire staff. Some were nervous, some were still skeptical, but all of them were watching. Henry took a deep breath. I know things have changed, he said. I know some of you miss the way things used to be. I won't lie to you. This hasn't been easy, and it won't get easier overnight. A few servers exchanged glances. Lisa saw the uncertainty in their eyes. Henry continued. But I didn't build Calloway's to be just another restaurant, and I'm damn sure not going to let someone else take it from us. Silence. Then slowly, a few heads nodded. One of the newer waitresses, a girl named Mia, spoke up. I think the changes are good, she said. We've had more new customers in the past month than we did in 6. Lisa smiled. Momentum. And Henry? For the first time in a long time, he looked sure of himself again. Calloway's was no longer just a restaurant. It was a statement. It was proof that change could happen. But change wasn't just about making a decision. It was about proving that decision was right. Lisa knew that. Henry knew that. And now, they were about to face their final test. A last attempt to break Calloway's. The next evening, just as Calloway's began filling up for dinner service, a familiar figure walked through the door. Lisa tensed. Henry immediately saw him too. Mark Calloway. This time he wasn't alone. He had brought a group of men in suits, their expressions unreadable. Lisa's stomach turned. This wasn't just a visit. This was an attack. Mark approached Henry with the same calculated confidence he had last time. You're making a mistake, he said, voice smooth and measured. Henry didn't flinch. I've made plenty, but not this one. Mark smirked. The investors are still interested. They're willing to increase their offer. One last chance, Henry. Walk away while you still can. Silence. Lisa saw a few employees watching. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Henry took a slow breath. Then he shook his head. Calloway's isn't for sale, he said. Mark's smirk faltered. You're holding on to something that won't last, he said. Henry tilted his head slightly. Funny, he said. That's exactly what people told me when I first opened this place. Lisa felt pride rise in her chest. Mark exhaled sharply. You're going to regret this. Henry smiled. I don't think I will. Mark gave him one last look, then turned on his heel and walked out. The suits followed. And just like that, it was over. For real this time. Calloway's reborn Lisa let out a slow breath, turning to Henry. You okay? She asked. Henry chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, he said. I think I am. Lisa smirked. So, what now? Henry glanced around at the restaurant, at the guests enjoying their meals, at the staff who had stood by him, at Lisa who had become more than just an employee. Now? Henry said, exhaling. Now we run this place the way it was always meant to be. Lisa smiled. For the first time in a long time, Calloway's felt like home. For both of them. And this time, nothing was going to take it away.